Well, welcome everybody to this meeting hosted by the East Surrey Family History Society. And it gives me very great pleasure to welcome today our two guest speakers. We have with us Dr. Anita Quye from the University of Glasgow, who is head of the History of Art. And we also have with us Dr. Patricia, who is the archivist for the London Borough of Southwark, which archive holds this very interesting, I hope to hear more about, archive, which is the collection and records from the Crutchley family, who were dyers in Southwark. So without more ado, Patricia, I'm going to hand over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Hilary. Let me just share my screen a second. The way this is going to work is that I will be bookending the talk, so to speak. I'll give a brief introduction to the archive and then introduce my colleague Anita, who will give more explanation about the archive and, more importantly, its significance. And then I will step in at the end, sort of explain the next steps, as it were, in terms of the archive. So to start off, the Crutchley Archive, a colourful textile history. So to introduce you to the archive, oh, goody. Yes, there we go. It was donated to Southwark Archives in 2011 by Mrs. Annie Crutchley. And in fact, it was the 5th donation in 2011. And what we knew about it when it arrived is that there were 15 volumes or bits of volumes that dated from the 18th century. And they were all records of a dyeing company, a fabric dyeing company owned by Annie's husband's family. And they'd been kept in the family since the 18th century. And they were fine until, I cannot remember for the life of me whether they were stored in an attic or a cellar, but they were fine until I think the late 20th or early 21st century, when there was a burst pipe. And so by the time we got them, they'd been damaged by water, mold, and pests. And it was obvious that sort of the pests included both mice who were nibbling around the edges and also bugs who were making sort of smaller holes in some of the volumes. And some of the volumes had fabric samples attached. Annie told us that she'd offered the collection to the V&A, and the V&A had very politely turned her down. And so she thought that maybe the local archive that covered the area of the dyeing firm would want to have them. And we said, well, yes, obviously, it's old. Yeah, sure, we'll take it. These pictures are all of the collection, more or less as we found it in 2011. I think they're dated a bit later than that. As you can see from the left-hand picture, some of the volumes were really quite badly damaged indeed. You can see some mold on the cover of the pattern book in the center, and on the right-hand side, you can get an idea of what we mean when we say there were fabric samples attached to some of these volumes. They're probably wool, we figured in 2011, and that was about all we knew about it. In fact, that is a screenshot of my work laptop, which has the collection level description that we wrote approximately in 2011, and that's the entire catalog for the collection, is like less than 1 page of A4, just very briefly describing what's going on. And that's pretty much all we knew about it until 2014, when Anita turned up in the search room and said, I hear you have some dyeing company records. May I see them, please? And I think that's where, Anita, if you want to take over.
Very happy to. Thank you, Patricia. That's a very nice introduction and beautifully introduced. So I'm just going to share my screen and I'll pick up the story from where we are on it. So oops, so hopefully you can see a first slide that just picks up on this. And before I sort of like launch in a little bit deeper, just to say that you'll notice another couple of logos on here. So we've got the CNRS, which is the French Research Council equivalent to the UK councils, the CIAM. This is representing Dr. Dominique Cardon, who has got one of the French Chevalier awards for her research in archaeology and textiles history in terms of dyeing. So she was one of the research team, and also Jenny Balfour-Paul, who's Dr. Jenny Balfour-Paul, who's a research fellow at the University of Exeter as well. So what I'm presenting here is the research that I sort of led, but then have brought in these two esteemed researchers along with it to try and understand this amazing archive. So like Patricia mentions, I'll tell you a bit about like what it looks like and the detail on it. But my first look was one of utter amazement. I literally did, I have to say, I did go in without too much high expectation about what was going to be there in front of me. There are quite a lot of dye books and archives that have got maybe some samples in it and a little bit of written information, or lots of dye samples that are maybe more of a pattern, like a sample book that somebody might use to show their designs or something in, but with no detail about dyeing. There's usually very few dates, there's usually very few names and connections. So that was my expectation. So when Patricia took out these 15 books, within 5 minutes, I was like, oh my goodness, what have we got here? This is, I could see already it was something very special from anything that I had been involved with through my research in this. So this is an actual picture from that day. I think it was the 24th of June, if I remember right. It was a very significant day, or 20th of June. And it was quite unbelievable. So I said I'd be back and followed it up. And then in 2020, last year, we went from, you know, these are my first photographs of that visit in June. We went from looking at these collections, you know, like there was very large books that are sort of like, you know, sort of very sizable, very thick books, lots of writing, very much working books. You can see the one on the top right has got things that are scored out on them, so very practical sort of stuff. There's a little book of names and dates. We went from this to thinking this looks amazing, to within sort of like, it did take us quite a long time, within 6 years, which sounds a huge amount of time, but was such a lot to get through in the books. We went through being able to sort them into some chronological order. That was many amazing things about this collection. One is that they are sequentially dated. 2 is the amount of information in it. They have over 1,000 of these dyed samples, which dyers call patterns. So the name pattern book was actually written on some of the large book covers, for example. We had, like I say, these working documents from actually inside the dye house. Plus we had this incredible connection to the Crutchley family through the donation. So it was quite unbelievable. So that was what we revealed after, you know, sort of a few years of research. And it was for that reason that we nominated it for the UNESCO Memories of the World, which is a way of identifying and preserving really important documented evidence. And we were absolutely thrilled that it got accepted for the register. So that has now given it a protected status, and that sort of sense it allows, you know, much more research to be done, and for Southwark Archive and Patricia and her great team to really, you know, tell the world about what this collection is and share it. So as Patricia mentioned, they were very fragile collections. So part of that reason for taking our time with this, we only had 2 research visits to the archives, myself, Dominique and Jenny. We spent a total of 2 weeks out of that 6 weeks actually physically with the archive. So it was incredibly intense work, but it was also to be very careful work because the pages were so delicate. There were some things we just could not access, and the book here is one of the ones which is subsequently gone for conservation support and work to make it more accessible, but there was plenty more that we could look at. So here we are. Jenny is in blue and Dominique is in the yellow coloured top. It was a very intense work. We each had our own kind of ideas that we wanted to look at. Dominique is looking at French archives of dyers from a similar period. So this was a unique opportunity to compare what was happening in the Crutchley dye houses and in the French ones. And I'll come a bit more to about the family and their significance in the moment. But just to give you a sense of what we were doing, very much working in the archive here. Some of the things that we were the key thing that these books was talking about was a particular kind of dyeing technique called in-grain dyeing. So grain is a medieval word for cochineal and kermes, which are natural dyes that come from insects. And this mode, this sort of like specialized dyeing to get red shades is called grain dyeing. So when you dye in grain, it means that you are creating scarlet colors and variations of shades relating to what you could get with cochineal. And we found that the dyers were, in these dye books, were also using Brazil wood, which is a imported plant dye stuff, or a tree-based material. You can see on these two images here, there's lots, the archive is just delightful in so many ways. There are little cutout pieces of obviously very precious information that is in these books. I just want to put this in context because dyers' books, as you might know or might not know, they are protected information. So for this information to have gone beyond the walls of the dye house would have been very, very unusual. So we are seeing a very privileged amount of detailed information. And like I said, I've never seen anything as detailed as the descriptions that they give. So what these books represent is the day-to-day working, but also the information for these dye houses that was really pertinent to what the Crutchley dyers were doing, or in their dye works. And you might notice that the text, particularly on the one hopefully on your right hand screen, side of your screen, you can see it's not written in English. This is Flemish or Old Dutch. So there was lots of intrigue, and we started looking. We were like, okay, well, we can see it's grain dyeing. They actually say the words in grain. There's English and there's also Flemish text as well. And these are, the text here is the actual dye recipe, for want of a better word. So imagine doing cooking and you get a list of ingredients. This is what the dyers are saying. So the one here on the right has got 2.5 alum, which is a mordant, an alum mordant, a mug of spirits, cochineal here, chusnelly, for example. So, and you can see here importantly, it says spring water, and this relates to where the dyers were located. So we have the kind of books I've just shown you, these sort of earlier books, the ones between sort of 1722 and 1726. Some pages were very clearly dated and others we had to work quite hard to see a date on the page, but once we found it, that was why we could put them in that chronological order. So the books that were sort of like pre 1726, 1728, I think it was the latest ones, they were in that sort of more rough and ready state that I've just shown you. And then from 1736 onwards, right up to the very last entry in 1744, there's much more sort of like polished kind of look to them. So there's quite a distinct difference. You can see the patterns, the dyed samples, which are essentially the dyer saying, I've dyed this and I'm keeping a record of the colour that I achieved. So that's what these little strips of fabric are showing. And I'll show you a little bit more detail about what these entries look like in a moment, but you can see here the colours that the dye house was able to produce, as well as these in-grain colours, these very rich, deep colours that they describe as reds and vines. They were also able to dye out of grains. This is using the exhausted dye baths. So you've taken your very rich colours, you've maximised the amount of dye you can get out the dye bath, and then you use what's left over and recycle the dye bath, and you get these sort of softer shades, for want of a better word, but they could still be quite deep colours. They were just a different sort of shade range, using, again, dye plants, so things like fustic and Brazilwood, for example, which are not as fast to light as cochineal, so they were a bit more sensitive to fading, for example, so a lower quality relatively. So what would these samples, these patterns relate to? Well, they are very like a fabric called broadcloth, which was used a lot for military uniform. We do not have a definite connection. This is what it is. But the top picture, the one with the red pattern on its side, you hopefully can see there's a sort of or a white middle bit to it. So that is, this broadcloth is a felted wool. So it's woven and then it's felted on the top, teased out to make this sort of matted wool surface, which is very hard wearing. It's almost waterproof in a sense as well, and that was felted and then it was dyed, so that the felted wool was made and then it was dyed on that. So the dye house was being supplied with undyed fabric, and then they were dyeing it in these shades. And there's loads more research to do in terms of that. The names of the kinds of cloth, Salisbury, Colchester, loads of different fabric types, is very exciting to textile historians, and we are sure to be able to sort of connect them up to where they come from. I mentioned this unusual, it's unusual to find in a UK dye book text that's written that's not in English. There's a lot known and in textile history that there was this sort of transfusion of knowledge and expertise between dyers. And it's also very well known that in this sort of 18th century and pre-18th century period, that the dyers that were in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in the Flemish countries, low countries, that they were expert in dyeing with madder, with dyeing this scarlet colours. But this is the very first really sort of like tangible evidence that has been found. So that in itself just makes the Crutchley archive remarkable. The other incredible thing is that if you're at all mildly linguistic, and my linguistic skills, I have to confess, are pretty poor, but even I could see that the text that's on the left, so it says long bocking, this is all written in Flemish, and the text that's on the right is a literal transcription. So the person at the time, this is in 1726, I think, for these ones here, the person at the time has literally copied or noted the Flemish text and copied it into English with additional information. And this is where it gets extremely exciting, because I mentioned spring water in one of the earlier ones. Well, in the English text, there is it actually says the River Thames in the text for where you get your water from. And there's a great distinction between whether you get it from the river or whether you get it from a spring or a well. So all these are really important to dyers. You need different kinds of quality water, different kinds of mineral content in the water is going to have an impact on the quality of your colour that you get at the end. So having a dye works near a river or a water source is always really important, and you want it to be sort of like of the quality that's relevant for you. The other lovely thing was that it talked about the crumpled bit of paper that you can see on the right here is just a list. Somebody's just left a list of all the things they were, either an inventory for what they were going to, had already in the workshop, the dyeing workshop, or the things they were going to purchase. So ladles, kettles, which are cauldrons for dyeing, all sorts of wonderful things. Like I say, it's just the immediacy of this archive. You just really feel that you can almost like look over the shoulders of people and see what they're doing, the way that they've written things down. yeah, so this is just an example here. I mentioned also about some of these like very much in the dye house books. This is unprecedented here, what I'm showing you. There's a series of 4 notebooks. So for anybody that's a scientist, my chemistry training as an undergraduate chemist was you kept a lab book and you kept a lot of notes and you wrote down what you did for your experiments and whether it went right or wrong. This is the kind of equivalent for dyers. They literally are just noting, annotating what they were doing on a daily basis in terms of what they were using. So how much they were using of the dyes, how much they were using of mordants, which is a mineral salt that's needed to hold the dye onto the fabric and give the very beautiful colours. And they are just listing them here. The beauty of these books is hopefully you can see there's a red tinge colour to them. You might be able to see speckles of colour, drops and smears on them. The one on the right's got very clear little spots. These were actually right there beside the dyers when they were dyeing these fabrics, and these little annotations must connect into the books, those more detailed books that I just showed a moment ago. I've delved a little bit and started to connect up some of them, but it's a whole research project in itself. This is truly at the dye bench with the dyers. It's quite remarkable. And you'll also notice that beside the little listings, there are these little monograms too. And these are, again, you know, we've not seen this from the dyer's side. These monograms are used a lot with by weavers of tapestries, for example, what they call weaver's marks. We're not sure yet if these marks are relating to the dyers that did the dyeing, if they relate to the client that they were dyeing for, or if it's to mark a certain grade of textile, perhaps, because textiles were also marked in this way. And in fact, there is a grading and a quality of textiles that is very well known, which is shown by putting clamping a little bit of lead with a monogrammed mark onto it to denote the quality, or that it's passed the acceptance for it from a merchant's perspective as well. And there is a relationship again in the kind of style of these monograms in these dye books to the lead seals that are on the cloth, but we haven't had the time yet to connect them up, but there's very strong evidence, which I'll come to for those in a minute. So actually, leading on from the lead seals, this is looking, I'm standing in this image on the left, I'm standing on the South Bank. I'm sure you're very familiar with it, South Bank of the Thames, so behind me is the Shard, I suppose actually is the best way of describing it, looking along, and you can see the low shoreline here. The excavations over the past couple of centuries have brought up a lot of these lead cloth seals that I was mentioning, and they are in the Museum of London, the British Museum, and a lot of work's been done on those from an archaeology perspective. So we have something that we can now research and go to compare to those dye marks that are in the books in the Crutchley archives. So that's tremendously exciting. So this brings me now a bit more to who are the Crutchleys and what were they doing. Again, to have a 300-year provenance to these dye books and to the actual family who these books belong to is just absolutely outstanding. Annie Crutchley was amazing. Between Patricia, Lisa Moss, who worked in the archive as well, and Annie, allowing us access to the private papers that are still in the family collection. So there is, for example, a will, which is very, very important. So a little bit of context about who the family were. So the dye collection centres around somebody called John Crutchley, and he was born around about 1676 and he died in 1728. And his we know he was either the son or the nephew of somebody called Thomas or Edward Crutchley, and both Thomas and Edward Crutchley were both dyers. And we know that on the 16th of June in 1691, so it had been around about 14 or 15, John Crutchley was apprenticed to a dyer called John Trimmer. And we also know from discussions with the Worshipful Dyers, a company of dyers, and the gentleman in the picture here is Ian McIntosh, who's the archivist for the company of dyers. We were able, Ian was able to sort of like to confirm that on the 15th of July in 1698 that John Crutchley was made a freeman of the Dyers Guild, and then he became a liveryman of the Worshipful Company in May 1710. And in the family papers, there is a bill showing John Crutchley trading as John Crutchley and Co. by 1718. So we knew that he went on from his apprenticeship and then he was running his own dye works. Through somebody called David Mitchell, who's a historian that we connected into via the Victorian Albert Museum, he's incredibly helpful with his research. He's been interested in the dyers and the sort of general sort of like textile industry of London around about the same time as the Crutchleys. And he was able to sort of point us very clearly towards the apprenticeships of John Crutchley, which I'll come to in a moment. In 1699, John Crutchley married Alice Coleman, and they had 6 children. They had 1 daughter, and they had 5 sons, and 4 of the 5 sons went on to become dyers. We had William, who was apprenticed in 1720, and he died in 1727. There was Thomas, who died in 1739. Coleman, who was also a merchant as well as a dyer, and he died in 1744. And Jeremiah, who died in 1752. And Jeremiah really did take the business off on his own, into his own sort of like business side. And he's the most famous one in terms of making his money. He really is a very good businessman, and he's the one that that really sort of like pinned that in. The daughter Anne married somebody called Caleb Flower, who was a merchant, tailor and citizen, and they married in November 1721. And the business that I mentioned Jeremiah had was in Wandsworth in London from 1748 on the High Street Bridge. So coming back to this document that I'm showing here, this tripartite was really important. It's dated 1721, the 31st of January, and it's signed and sealed by John Crutchley with his son Thomas and a partner called Nathaniel Shawnee, who was a dyer, also mentioned in it. And it talks about the joint trade and act as dyers of a dye house. And their very words are lying and being in Dead Man's Place near the bankside of the River Thames. And in this agreement, John was sort of like reducing his share of the dye works to that, and he took up residency in Blackheath around about 1723 or 24. So he mentions that he bequeaths to his sons, Thomas and William. He talks about a leasehold estate in Clink Street or elsewhere in the parish of St Saviour of Southwark. So this is very, very close to the archive that Patricia is in on Borough High Street. So literally is within like a half a kilometre distance. So when the archive came to into Southwark Archives, that was what we knew or expected to find. Now, unfortunately, the actual dye works does not exist anymore in Clink Street. It's kind of like behind the Vintners buildings that's just running up towards Borough High Street or Borough Market. It's the footprints in there somewhere, but the Georgian maps of London show very clearly a long building there that is labelled dye works, and it's just for copyright reasons that I've not shown the map here. But if you can get access to that, I mean, we would dearly love to know. There must be maps of that period that are in local archives and things. We would very much like to know where those are, and to see a bit more detail around there. So that was great. It was only through doing the research that we realised in the documents there also was a second dye house mentioned, which we'd kind of not really kind of recognised at the time. David Mitchell mentioned it. And And this was a property that John bequeathed to his grandson, John. It gets very confusing, as it always does, who was son of Thomas, although unfortunately the grandson didn't survive very long. And in this bequeathment, John gives his grandson and his son Thomas a share of his messuage. A messuage is a land for houses or outbuildings, which is associated with dye houses and premises. And he talks about them being in the Maze in the parish of St. Olaf. And that was incredibly exciting. And I'll show you sort of where that's located in a moment. So we were able to take this information to Ian, who was able to sort of like dig a little bit deeper and I don't have time to really go into all the great information that Ian's pulling out from the Worshipful Company side. But the most important thing is that this maze, there was a dye house in the Maze in 1706 that belonged to John Trimmer. John Trimmer was a partner in it, and I mentioned that John Crutchley was apprenticed to Trimmer. And John Trimmer was a kinsman and an inheritor of somebody called William Trimmer, who was a well-known dyer in the parish of St. Olaf, who died in 1675. So we had a really strong, tangible kind of like a connection to this. So the distance between the Maze in that part of Southwark, it's literally just within the shadow of the Shard, and Clink Street, Dead Man's Place, is again within about sort of like half a kilometre distance. There's a sort of like a triangle between where the archive ended up being in 2011 to where the dye house was in Clink Street and the one that was in the Maze. And like I say, unfortunately, the dye house in the Maze doesn't have any existing buildings there either. So the relationship of is important because up until these books were we started researching the books, I have to say the Worshipful Company of Dyers were a little bit kind of like, we know about some dye work that was happening on the south bank of the river, but we've never heard of the Crutchley. And the amount of dyeing that this company was doing is significant. I mean, to produce, like thousands of dyed patterns in their books and thousands of recipes, they were, a daily dyeing that you can see in the later books shows it's a significant things. So this relationship between the South Bank and across the bridge, this isn't showing London Bridge here. This is the railway link, but the London Bridge is just behind it. But that connection sort of like makes a whole lot of sense, and things wouldn't have gone up further. The river, the Crutchleys were just at the point where you couldn't get any further up the river beyond London Bridge with sort of trading vessels and stuff. So they were in a prime spot, a real prime spot on the South Bank. So this is the links, and there's also John Coleman as well. John Crutchley's connected to John Coleman, and John Coleman was a prime warden for the Worshipful Company too. So the Worshipful Company were very excited and very incredibly supportive of this research, and there's plenty more to do there. So that's just showing the relationship of things. You might well be familiar. Oops, sorry, go back one. So here here's a photograph taken looking down Clink Street, and the dye works is just tucked in behind the old cathedral here. And this is me with my back as if I was standing against one of the walls of the Crutchley's Clink Street dye works, if it still existed, looking across to the cathedral here. And then the Maze at St. Olaf, I've kind of pinpointed it a bit. I think there was dye works just at this corner between Newcomen Street and the Great Pond, or the Maze Pond Road that now runs up through the middle of Thomas and Guy's. So we've got it's very evocative to walk around the streets and to think that, the things that are written about in these dye books was happening just under your feet. Quite incredible. So I'm sure that this is the bit that everybody's very most interested in. So who's named and who's in it? So there are clients that are named. So the South Sea Companies and the East India Company. These are obviously very large companies, but surprisingly, they're not mentioned as much as you might expect in the Crutchley dye works. They're obviously significant, but there's a lot more individual names. So this example that I'm showing here on the right hand side, it's the text that's in the top bit. So where it says 402, this is a dye pattern that's in a book from 1741. So you can see it's beautifully done because it's got a date. So you know this was dyed in 1741 for a Mr. Nettleton or Mr. Nettleson. And it tells us about what they did, that they grained the cloth, that they've used shalloons, they've dyed scarlet, and they've told us what they've dyed it with. So this is the information. So as well as the dye books giving us name, and like I said, we've still got much work to do on this, and it's going to have to take at least 2 or 3 PhD students, textile history or economic history to work their way through it. We've also got these what are called cash books, notebooks, and they're dated from 1721 to 25. And this hopefully will be something that will resonate with you. We're not entirely sure what the cash is for. We presume that it's for customer orders. So this is some people paying the Crutchleys to dye fabric for them. And the astounding thing is it ranges from all of 5 shillings up to nearly £3,000. So that was a huge spread of who they were dyeing for. So they had small clients, individual clients, big companies, and the big East India companies, South Seas companies weren't the ones that were spending the £3,000 a year. Quite outstanding. It just so happens for equality and diversity purposes, it's very handy that the Madam Dunas or Duras, that there's at least one female client mentioned in these books. It appears that the rest are male, but we need to kind of investigate that a little bit more because I'm not quite sure if this is a contact person or if it's the actual person that owns the tailoring or whatever, merchants, whatever. So they are lists of names. Now, I'm very happy to send via Hilary a little Word document that has the names and, of course, the important first name or initial to go along with it. But I thought I'm just going to spend a little moment to allow you to absorb it here. So here are the surnames of the people that are mentioned in those cash books between 1701 and 1725. We do not know if these people were in London. They might have been further around Britain. They might not have even, there might have been a client who was maybe on a route somewhere else. We don't know yet, but I'd be absolutely fascinated if there's any names that jump out to you personally. I've got another page of them, so I'll just move on to this. And like I say, I'll send the Word document so you can look at it at leisure. And I should have pointed out on the previous one, Caleb Flower, who married the daughter, he's mentioned, and he's actually one of the ones that spends a significant amount of money or is noted with a significant amount of financial transaction against his name in these cash books. So that sort of very astute marriage, that's sort of like between them is quite outstanding. So just finally, in the last couple of slides, just to sort of say what the dyes were. So if anybody's interested in how the colours were achieved, this is the cochineal beetle. It's like a little insect, it's little tiny things. Sadly, the little bodies get dried, but they've got 90% of this red dye in them. So this is like an example of what they look like. So you've got insects. There's also something called lac, which you get shellac from. You can also get a dye from the excretion of the lac insect. And this is an example of madder, which gives a pretty good red colour, but not as red and as scarlet as cochineal and lac. So all the dyes mentioned in this little table here, they are all natural dyes from plants and insects. And we've got some very exciting plans to recreate some of these dyeings as well in the future as part of the bigger plans. And just very, very quickly to say that we did some scientific research. So Dominique was able to take colour measurements in the archive, the colour descriptions and the ability of these dyers with their colour vision to colour match is quite outstanding. And very interestingly, some of the dye and shade names that are in the Crutchley books, she's found them in the French dyers books that she's looking at from a similar period. So dove grey or silver drab does actually mean something to dyers. They've got very similar colour tones to them that Dominique can measure with her scientific instrument. And also the classification of things that are scarlet is very, very good colour matching on that. In the middle and on the right hand side of this image, these are two researchers, Dr. Julie Pertz and Dr. Jing Han, who finished their PhDs with me doing their own different research projects, and they also got involved in some of the Crutchley dye analysis. So up at Glasgow, we can do chemical analysis and identify the dyes. So I was able to sort of like confirm that the dyes that are in the text, when the dyers say they use such and such, was actually on the patterns, the dyed patterns beside them, which is very exciting. But some of the dyes I mentioned are not good colour fastness. So this is implications for sort of showing the archive and accessing it. So I'm sure Patricia will pick up on this in a moment, but so able to do some studies just to see how much protection these the books will need when they get displayed and accessed. So this is ongoing work at Glasgow. So it's things like Brazilwood and logwood are the things that we need to be aware of, because they are quite sensitive to light. So we don't want these beautiful colours to be lost as they are examined, and even under artificial light in very careful spaces like archives and museums, these colours could be lost. I mean, we found a few mismatches. So it was the earlier books, so not quite sure if it was deliberate or if it was an accidental sort of like misrepresentation of what was being dyed with, or maybe there's been some dye loss in the intervening 300 years, and we've lost the chemical evidence behind from it. So essentially, we are looking at master dyers. The books, we cannot say hand on heart that it was the Crutchley dyers that were doing the dyeing. We just know that these books are associated with the dye works that the Crutchley family had. So we are deeply intrigued when we come across mentions of, as well as the Flemish text, whoever these dyers were, that there's also mention of a Mr. Hodson or Hodson's dye house that it seems like the apprentices or dyers went to. I'll find the information for you perhaps when we sort of chat later on. But certainly what the Crutchley dye works was producing was, you know, very, very good fabric, and in some cases sort of excellent quality, but it was very good quality fabric. So I just will end my part here and hand back over to Patricia, and just to say that there's a lot of people to thank. So yes, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll hand back over to Patricia.
Thank you, Anita. That was amazing. And it never fails to astound me, no matter how many times I hear about the collection. It just never fails to astound me how amazing it is. So my last bit, and I should actually have put this into the PowerPoint that I created, but I wanted to give you an idea of what the significance is. And so that comes into sort of explaining what Anita mentioned, the Memory of the World Register. And I thought I'd start by explaining what that is, which sort of starts out by explaining UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It was founded in 1945, and it seeks to build peace through international cooperation in education, the sciences, and culture. As its constitution says, since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So it's UNESCO runs international tsunami warning systems. It also, if you've ever been to Bath, a World Heritage Site, or Stonehenge, which is a World Heritage Site, it runs the World Heritage Site program. But it also runs the Memory of the World program, which is basically starting in 1992, UNESCO recognized that in an awful lot of the world, documentary records are in a poor state of preservation and they're very difficult to access. You know, you've seen the pictures of the Crutchley archive and how you know, damaged and disintegrated it got over 300 years. And if you multiply that by records that are in areas that are much hotter and more humid and happier places for pests to live, you get an idea of what can happen very, very quickly to absolutely irreplaceable records. So the aims of the Memory of the World program are to facilitate preservation of the world's documentary heritage, to assist provision of universal access to documentary heritage, and to increase global awareness of the existence and importance of documentary heritage, which sounds like something you wouldn't have to do, but even the number of people who walk into the archive, or at least walked into the archive search room in the before times and said, I had no idea that this even existed, you really do need an international program that explains what archives are and why they're important. So the flagship program for that is the Memory of the World Register, which lists, there's two actually, the International Register, which began in 1997, and the National Register, which I'll get to in a second. So the International Register lists documentary heritage, which has been recommended by the International Advisory Committee and endorsed by the Director General of UNESCO as corresponding to the selection criteria regarding world significance and outstanding universal value. So the idea is that if something is on the International Memory of the World Register, that's sort of something that we would box up to put away in case of a disaster that threatened all of humanity. Sort of, what do we want to show the future, or, you know, the aliens who find Earth in several million years to explain what humanity was like. So some of the records on the International Register related to the UK these are stills from the 1916 film The Battle of the Somme, which was filmed during the Battle of the Somme. It's one of the first war documentaries in history. The image on the bottom left-hand side is the Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral, which is, it is not a accurate map of the world, but it is a map of the world that explains a huge amount about how medieval Europeans envisioned their world. And at the top right is a telegram from Eric Blair, better known as George Orwell, and his personal papers are inscribed on the International Memory of the World Register. There's also the UK's National Memory of the World Register, which the first entries for that were in 2010. And that honors documentary heritage of national and regional significance. As its website, as the UK Memory of the World website says, it's Britain's collective memory. So the entries for that include the Booth poverty map, the Booth Poverty Survey, that's the map on the upper left, and the records of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission on the lower right. On the upper right-hand side is the LCC bomb damage maps, which have also been inscribed in the Memory of the World Register, UK Memory of the World Register, and the Jersey Occupation Archive, which is basically the records of the only part of the UK to have been invaded by the Germans during World War II. So the submission process is biannual. There's a great big form that you need to fill out, and you need to indicate that the records are authentic, that is, that they are what they say that they are, and they're significant. Basically, that the UK's heritage would be damaged severely if they were lost or destroyed. Specifically, you need to clearly state why the nominated heritage is of outstanding significance to the UK. So you have to prove not just that you think it's really neat, but that it's unique and irreplaceable, and that it's outstandingly informative in comparison to similar groups of records. So you need at least 2 referees. We got Anita, Jenny, and Dominique to be our referees for this, because you need to explain not just that this set of records is amazing, but this set of records offers more information about, say, the place that was Bankside, or the time that was the 18th century, or the subject that is textile history, than any other collection in the UK. So to give you an idea, our peers, the other entries in the UK Memory of the World Register for 2020 are the James Watt papers. So scientist James Watt's scientific papers, and specifically his work around the separate condenser that revolutionized steam engines and made them sort of commercially viable, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel's report on the screw propeller. So basically 2 absolutely iconic pieces of British scientific history and us, which is quite amazing. What I did not put in is, as you saw, quite a lot of the collection is in a quite poor state of preservation. As well as being inscribed on the Memory of the World Register, we've had another piece of recognition of how important the collection is, which is in 2018, we received £20,000 from the National Manuscripts Cataloguing Trust to be able to get the 3 most fragile, most sort of imperiled volumes in the collection conserved. So that was going along nicely until the pandemic started, and now it's taking longer than we thought it would, but the 3 of them are in quite good shape. They won't be books probably by the time we're finished. They'll be flat sheets, but that's the simplest, easiest way to keep the information that they contain safe for future generations. So at this point, our next steps will be looking into how we can get funding to conserve the rest of the collection. Hopefully the Memory of the World Register will help with that. I think that's everything, actually.